You're listening to What's Contemporary Now, a show about culture and the people, places, and things that together make it up.
Angelo Flaccavento, to me, is very much a writer's writer. He animates entire worlds in the mind's eye with nothing more than the written word, creating these tactile layers throughout his highly illustrated style of storytelling. Rather than wander near the edges of banality as some might, he imbues criticism with a deeper meaning, or at the very least a perspective that leaves you thinking about the subject a little bit differently. With the same curiosity, periodic self-doubt, and constant questioning that shapes his work, he tells us the story of his childhood, how he arrived in a position where his words carry such impact, and what has driven that journey, all the while remembering to share what he believes is contemporary now.
This is Angelo Flaccavento, and we're talking about what's contemporary now.
Angelo, I'm so happy we finally managed to get you on. I've wanted to speak to you for quite some time. This is an absolute honor. It's a habit of ours to start at the beginning with each guest because it's always nice to hear about someone through their own words, especially when it comes to their childhood and those early experiences that might have shaped them. So tell us about the early life of Angelo Flaccavento.
I come from the province, let's say, from the outskirts, provincia in Italian. Italy is a country of very different identities. Every city or every region had its own identity. And if you grow up in the provincia, you always have this mirage, let's say, of the big city, because the provincia can be so sleepy. So I grew up in Sicily, in Ragusa, and I was exposed to fashion right from the start because not one, but two relatives of mine, both the sister and the brother of my father, had the boutiques. And it was the late 70s, early 80s. So there was the moment when Italian fashion was booming. And actually, the little stores in the provincia were the ones that created the whole phenomenon in Italy. So especially my aunt, Tina, she was carrying all the big brands. She started with Walter Albini, who was the seminal designer in the late 70s. And she carried on to Versace, Ferré, all those kind of brands. And so my father used to drop me to the store because he was running errands nearby. And I got hooked to the clothing and also to the magazines that were in the store. I was always kind of a loner child. I have a younger sister, but I spent time on my own a lot. I always liked drawing, writing a little bit less, a little bit later. Everything creative was, I remember redressing all my sister's dolls in my own way, very punky or experimental. My aunt saw how interested I was in that, so she was carrying me to the fashion shows in Milano, which for me were like a big revelation because it was something completely out of the world for me. For instance, I was present at that seminal Versace show with the supermodel singing George Michael at the end. So you can imagine what kind of impression that made. But I also have a distinct memory of being interested right away in something a little bit more lateral, let's say, or a little bit less institutional in terms of aesthetic. In that moment in Milano, there was a Comme des Garçons store, which funnily enough is where now is the J.W. Anderson store on Via Sant'Andrea. And the store was the 80s concept of Comme des Garçons, which was raw, concrete, metal, and almost an empty store. And I remember passing by with my aunt, looking at the window that was empty and telling her, I want to be inside this place. It's so fascinating. And she didn't want me to get in because it looked a little bit scary as a place, a little bit off kilter, let's say. And the clothes were really post-apocalyptic because Com in that moment was all black, holes, asymmetric, not very glamorous. But I remember also that I was fascinated by clothing as objects and also by clothing through the representation they had in pictures and in magazines. So she had a lot of magazines coming through because there were like free subscriptions or maybe brands that were offering something. And I remember once she got a copy of this experimental magazine called We Stuff, which was a magazine that Maria Luisa Frisa and Stefano Tonchi were doing in Florence in the mid-80s. And Florence at that moment was like the London of Italy. It was a hub of creativity and the new languages. And flipping through this, I think it was issue number 1 or something, I read a small article about ID magazine, looking at the small pictures of this super colorful magazine. I was hooked. And a couple of years later, I managed to get a subscription. Can you imagine? It was like the late 80s, Sicily, and getting a subscription to a magazine coming from London. I remember I spent one whole morning at the post office to make this international money order. It went through. So the magazine arrived, let's say 1 month and a half late. And it was the only thing that I read for the 1 month and a half since the next issue would be dropped in my postbox. So I was reading cover to cover and cover to cover as many times as possible. And it's also how I learned to write my English, because I definitely think that my written English is better than my spoken English, because actually it's what I do mostly, writing in another language. I think those years were really formative because that moment was particularly free. In that moment, experimental magazines or independent magazines were truly independent. So there was barely any kind of advertising for big brands. And so no constraints to use the fashion in a certain way. In fact, I remember that most of the credits in fashion stories were crediting the brands and the stores carrying them, because I think that the editorials were made with stylists borrowing clothes from stores, not from press offices. And so I have really vivid memories of that time. That was really, for me, an imprinting. At one point, I also started reading The Face, but I've always have been team ID. I think that what Terry Jones and Trisha Jones have done, I consider them to be my godfather and godmother, because they had such a beautiful way to deal with image making. And the writing was fantastic. Sometimes it was impossible to read because it was printed in Dayglow pink over Dayglow yellow, maybe. And it was absolutely impossible to get the information. But I remember the editor at the time was Karen Franklin, who was a fantastic journalist. So there was a lot of information and there was a lot of attention to designers. And then there were these pages, straight ups, with people photographed around the streets of London. You saw that there were these people dressed in the most crazy way in their daily life. And I was so into that I thought, okay, I can do that in Ragusa as well. Who cares? This is my London. So I remember once, it was, let's say, 89, probably. I was in high school. It was a kind of hippie moment post the very first acid house wave. So I cut daisies into plastic and glued them on my jean jacket and went to school like that. And it was like a huge scandal. Like the teachers called my mom.
The teachers? I thought you were going to say other kids might have picked on you or something, but the teachers, why?
The thing is that I was always very good at school. I always got top grades. So for them, a guy with top grades must be someone very quiet in self-expression. They found it very strange. It wasn't done in a bad way, but they call anyway. So I continued going to shows with my aunt all along high school. And then I decided to study literature at university. I kept drawing all the time and I had the strong will to become a designer, but also I felt there was something not complete in that, because mostly I was satisfied with the drawing, not with the idea of making this real. So I thought, okay, I'm going to have a good schooling. I went to a good university, majored in art history. In my household, having top level schooling has always been considered of the most important value. So I thank my parents for that. My doctoral dissertation was about a couturier, Roberto Capucci. So, I mean, fashion kept being inside, but in a different way. And I am grateful that at the turning point, so the passage from high school to university, I had this clarity in mind and went for a more academic path.
I read that you wanted to be a fashion designer, and I was curious at what point that kind of goal changed and it ended up down the path of writing, because you are such an incredible writer. It seems like something that you would have dreamed of doing since you were very young.
No, I didn't. Actually, I've never dreamt to be a writer. I was always very good at writing, but I don't have a diary. I don't have any short stories in my drawer or anything. I write, but only on commission. This is also why I've never up until now written a book, because I either have someone telling me, this is the book, this is the deadline, you write it. Otherwise, I don't. I know it's a strange thing. Basically, what happened is that in my final year at grammar school, sometimes in those moments when you become a young adult, you start questioning your own passions. And I was really the top of the class, mostly in the humanistic disciplines, so writing, philosophy, and my first high school teacher, because I think I have many persons that have marked the important turning points in my life have been women of a certain kind of strict, not maternal, but very direct in their opinion. She told me, you're very good with writing and with this kind of thing. You should better pursue this kind of schooling and then maybe get back to what you want later. And I listened to her because my mom left me completely free to choose whatever I wanted to do because she knew I was a responsible kid. So there was no way for me to get lost. So I felt okay. And I was happy in the end that I chose this path. At university, I stopped drawing almost completely, but the passion for fashion was still there, always burning. So when I graduated in 97, there was still compulsory military service in Italy, which I didn't do. I was in Italian, we say obietore di coscienza. So you refuse to do that, but you have to do something alternative. I was lucky enough that I was the only guy that in that moment was an art history graduate. So I worked in a museum. They were making a catalog of ancient textiles. So I was hooked once again to that kind of activity. And when that was over, it was 1 year of compulsory military service. And then they made me a contract for another year. But it was not my thing to be a public employee. So I just stopped. I went to Paris, met with Rebecca Voigt, who at the time was the editor-in-chief of Dutch magazine. Mm-hmm. And I just told her, I want to write about fashion. And I want to write in this magazine. She later told me that she was so surprised that someone could just bang on the door and ask for a job. She told me, okay, do it. Can you write in English? I told her, of course I can write in English. I've never written in English before that. Of course, all my reading happened through English language magazine, but it was really the first time for me.
That's the thing with your writing that's, to me, such a writer's type of writing in that it's not just informational. There's always such a unique point of view and a distinct way of expressing that point of view. But obviously, you've also talked about the time it takes to find one's own voice, whether or not that's in the context of a designer at a new house or your own experience. But at what point did you feel like you found that voice that you now have today?
A very intelligent question, but also a very difficult one, because to be completely honest, I know from the response of people that I have my tone of voice and I know when I write what I like. So for me, what I say and the way I say, for me, style is just as important as the information or the opinion you're giving. But I also hopefully have the feeling that this tone of voice is endlessly evolving. My aim is not to have the feeling, oh, I got it. I'm always a little bit unsatisfied about myself so that I can push myself a little bit more. But to answer your question, I started my write-ups in the business of fashion around 2014. Let's say around 2018. My aim is always to be very direct, not too long, because I hate when a writer brings you around. I just want to go straight to the focus. Also because the write-up in particular that I have been assigned is very interesting because I come after daily articles from other writers. So I don't have to deal with the trivia or giving information about a collection because at that point, of course, my readership is mostly professional people. So they don't want me to know details about the staging or other things unless they are integral to my critical reading of the show. So I can be very sharp and very to the point. As a writer, I also always liked the idea of having a very strict setup number of words and a space that you can occupy. For me, the worst fear is do as you please. That thing for me is the worst because I can do a sonnet or a poem or a book. You never know. I always like to have a frame in which to move because the frame allows me to be free as I want to be, but also gives me borders in which to move.
Well, you have very interesting things that fuel your process. Something else that you brought up in an entirely separate conversation from the podcast was during a correspondence where we were talking about a piece and you mentioned self-doubt in relation to writing. But for you, it wasn't destructive. It was a productive kind of reference. You said that doubt is the essence of progress. So can you tell us what you meant by that?
I always question my opinions, other people's opinions, what I like and what I don't. One of the main pluses for me of working for a diverse range of publications is that I can have a very strong opinion, which is almost a gut reaction to a show. And sometimes the show that I really don't like are the ones that keep banging in my mind. And I keep thinking about them. I have the right to change my opinion, and I've done it many times. So what I didn't like at the beginning, maybe I like 6 months down the line because I see things from a different perspective. Because I see fashion criticism from a fashion show a little bit like a mix between being a theater critic and a fashion critic, because you judge a live performance in which the clothing is immersed into a whole experience. And sometimes I also notice it might sound a little bit silly, but the way you look at the show, if you had lunch or not, if you had an annoying conversation before that or no, if the person sitting at your side is occupying your space, make you feel uncomfortable. All those little elements add up to the final reading. Sometimes in a good way, sometimes in a bad way. For instance, if I skip lunch, I can be super grumpy. I know that. I try to be aware of that, but it's something that happens, especially if I am particularly harsh in judgment. And believe me, sometimes if I'm harsh, I have to deal with the reunion coffees with designers or the PRs afterwards because they want to know. Maybe when I go to these meetings, I still keep my opinion, but then when I see the reactions, maybe I question myself or change my mind or not change my mind, but I question maybe the way I express my judgment. Another person that's been really formative for me in my career is Paola Bottelli, who was the fashion editor at the Italian Financial Times, which is my main Italian gig as a critic. When I first started writing in the newspaper, she really liked the writing, but she told me, you're really too harsh. Because, you know, Christopher, in English-speaking journalists can be very direct. The New York Times, the Financial Times, they are very sharp articles. In Italy, we are a little bit more, let's say, nuanced in a way. So she told me, Angelo, you can keep your opinion. You don't have to kiss anybody's feet. But express that in a way that they don't get offended. And for me, that's the important thing, because my aim as a critic is not to show the world how harsh or how difficult to please I am. For me, criticism, which is the same thing that I received from all the women that I mentioned before. 1 week before doctoral dissertation, my teacher told me, this section needs to be rewritten for tomorrow because it doesn't work like this. And so for me, criticism is a constructive way to say this project is interesting, but there is these things that don't work. So the softer the opinion lands on the other person's table, the more effective it is. If you slash someone, they only think about the scar. They only see the blade cutting through the skin. While if you give that with the feathers before, maybe it's more pleasant than just getting a stab.
What a good metaphor. You're leading us into a very good question that we've asked a number of people, specifically critics, of course, which is, how do you view the role of the critic today, both in fashion as well as culture? Because the sort of main gig that you've just mentioned in Italy is for a general interest paper, right?
Absolutely. This is also what I really like. I have a wide range of publications. So I can write, let's say, more technically in the bits of fashion because I know that my readership is essentially of professional people. While Il Sole 24 Ore has not a fashion readership. So if I choose to put certain pictures with my articles, I know that they will get surprised because maybe it's more banker kind of people, you know, suit and tie. So for me, the role of the critic is more important today probably than it ever was, because comment is free and everybody has an opinion, but there is a deadly merge of commerce and opinion, and also the power of brands which have become mostly like media brands. And the control that they have over opinions is sometimes unbearable. Everybody has an opinion, but for me, the difference between a critic writing for a newspaper or a publication and a critic publishing their stuff on, let's say, Instagram, that kind of digital critic is mainly promoting themselves as the critics. They're branding themselves as critics, so as strongly opinionated individuals. While for me, the role of the critic in a publication is to help readers decode what they're saying and not to believe propaganda or any kind of storytelling that's been imposed by the brand. Because believe me, in my work, sometimes I see the show, I read the press release, I listen to the storytelling, and I tell myself, what the fuck is this? This is not making any kind of sense. You know, we get back to the topic of dub. I question everything. I want to question everything because, of course, you know, as a writer, if people like the way you write, and there are people who like my opinions and there are people who like my style. So sometimes I get hired by brands to write press releases. And I do sometimes I don't. But what I do is I always tell in the meeting is that I'm not going to have any kind of storytelling that I don't see in the clothing. Because if the storytelling is a made up story, this is bullshit. And me as a press release user, I don't want to read any kind of bullshit because that puts me in a bad mood already regarding the collection, because I think that you want to cover up for a lack of something. So let's be straightforward and that's it. So for me, the role of the critic in culture in general is to avoid being a voice of the propaganda and to offer instruments to the reader to decode things their own way. I don't want with my stories to tell people to have my opinions. My biggest hope is that I offer them instruments. So by reading my opinion, they may be from their own looking at things that I've shown them. Maybe they cannot agree with me, but they will have a way to read reality in another way. Because what we see can have so many points of access. It all depends on my own aesthetic experiences, your own aesthetic experiences, our upbringing, and everything we've seen forms us. As Diana Vreeland used to say, the eye has to travel, but the travels that I've done with my eyes are different from other people's travels with their eyes. So for me, it's not about pushing my opinion in someone else's brain, but rather to offer instruments to look at the world in a different way.
And how do you maintain that sort of level of honesty when having to navigate the kind of political landscape each season? Because obviously you've touched upon brands and their kind of desire to control what's said about them, and then the need to have a coffee with someone afterwards in the case you've given them a negative review. Does it become more challenging to navigate that integrity and honesty, or?
Absolutely. It becomes more and more. This thing really depends on my mood or on the season. Sometimes you get an email for a reunion coffee and you're like happy about it. And sometimes, it's just like, oh, I would just prefer to stop writing and don't have to deal with kind of necessities anymore. Because there are a lot of different things at stake in this kind of moments, because you doubt your self-worth, what you do, your opinion. Sometimes things can get out of scale because maybe your opinion brings brands to cut advertising budgets from a newspaper. And that's a huge impact on the newspaper itself, because we can put our hands on our eyes, but magazines and newspaper mostly survive not on sold copies, but on advertising that's been sold. I try to still be as open and honest as possible. Of course, you become a master of the nuance the more you are navigate to the writing through the years. Sometimes it just becomes impossible. This is really a big turmoil for me. I think there is no real solution, because also you deal with other people, with other personalities. For me, the worst thing is that sometimes you give a bad review to someone. Like, let's say, Gucci's first show with Sabato was immediately a no, you would see that. The guy is perfectly fine, but it was not meant to be a leader in there. So you give it a bad review, so the PR gets upset. So sometimes you just can cope with things. Others, you just get offended, or sometimes you just get sad. I mean, we're humans and I'm not a robot. So sometimes it really hits hard, because you know what? The problem is this. When you hit someone, one of the main responses that they can give you is, I don't invite you to the next show. So for me, that is a big no, because I think the activity of the critic can only happen when you look at things with your eyes live in the place, not through video, not through pictures, because a video is an edited point of view. It's not your point of view,
Mm-hmm.
If I decide to just look at the back of the show, I can, because I can turn and see the back of the models. While if I have the point of view of the official video, I can only see the front. It's really a fixed point of view, which is not decided by me. So if a brand, because it's offended, denies me access to the show, I'm denied the possibility to do my job the way I want to do it. And that, for me, is a detriment to my work. Because I will go to the show of the designer, even if I've slashed the previous show, because I'm always curious, always excited, and I never have a prejudice about the show. I can have loaded the one before and really like this one. I never know. That is also what is so exciting for me about fashion. The surprise. You never know what's going to happen. Sometimes you just go into a show bored. Let's say, okay, let's waste another half an hour. 2 years ago, I went to the first Bali show by Simone Bellotti. And I just went there because the PR told me, Angelo, please come. There is a new designer, because the one before was like really nothing. So I was like, oh, I don't want to come. I want to have a gelato, because it was a really packed day. Then I said, okay, let's go. You sit down, the show starts, and at the third look, you think, okay, this is going to be something. And thank God I came. Thank God the PR was insistent enough to have me here. I was not prepared at all to have a surprise. So for me, that show was the highlight of the season, and also a reminder why I like fashion so much, because you never know which way you can be surprised.
I would also imagine that you must be quite a sensitive person in order to write the way you do, because in the absence of the ability to feel those emotions, you probably couldn't convey them so effectively in the written word, right?
Absolutely. Christopher, my main aim actually when I write, at least what I have in mind, is that I am sitting, I take the reader by the hand, the reader sits beside me, and I just want to see things through my eyes and through my emotions. Then they can form their own, but I would like them to feel in the room with me. That's why there are so many atmospheric elements in my writing, because the feelings that I have at a show are manifold. There are many more layers than just looking at clothes. So I would like to convey that kind of emotional complexity to the reader.
You do it beautifully. I loved the quote from your piece from 10 magazine last year. The older I get, the more I prefer fantasy to reality, imagination to facts, and striding along fantastic paths of pure cerebral study. Don't get me wrong, I'm a dreamer, but not an escapist. I know that fantasy has to somehow crash to the ground in order to become reality. Yet I'm also adamant that keeping one's standards high and dreamlike is the only way to go. In that same article, you talked about the generative power of frustration. So what's your advice on how best to walk that narrow line of being the dreamer that knows when to land in favor of making things reality?
Oh, this is a really personal balance. I don't have a perfect recipe. I know for myself, when I had to start being just a dreamer and get my feet back on the ground, because I can be carried away very easily. I have a fervid and vivid imagination. So when I start looking at the show, sometimes my mind really drifts. And I have to say that sometimes I fall asleep at fashion shows, so I fill the voids with very little dreams. There is a colleague of mine who has an entire camera roll of me sleeping at shows. It's very difficult to navigate, because I know that one thing that I really want to avoid in being a dreamer or an escapist is like prizing the past compared to the present. Of course, when I was at that magical Margiela show, the last one from John Galliano, the one in January 24, of course, the first thing that I thought was like, oh, I've seen this from John 20 years ago or less when he was at Dior. Of course, it was another house, it was another aesthetic, but the roots were the same kind of imaginative mind and the kind of sense of glamour and decay. I wanted to push that feeling, I've seen this already, away, because I was seeing that anew in another context. And people who have never been there in the first place were seeing that for the first time in that moment. I hate when all the colleagues of mine tell me, oh, of course, shows in the 90s were so magical. There were so few people. Of course, okay. But fashion is also about pushing forward endlessly. So really, I don't have a way to say when to stop dreaming and when to start getting into reality, because it's something that I manage to do all the time. Sometimes when I write the press releases that I mentioned before, sometimes I just ask designers to tell me what they have been thinking that season, and I don't want to see the clothing because I imagine the clothing. I tell them, listen, if I see the clothing, I cannot write the press release anymore because Angelo the critic steps in. While Angelo the dreamer needs not to see the clothing, but needs to hear your words and form his fantasy in order to get your fantasy a shape into words.
Despite being Italian, you seem to favor Paris when it comes to markets for show season.
Absolutely. It's not because in Italy, we always think that the grass is greener on the other side of the fence, usually outside of Italy. For me, it's not about being in Paris, but I think that Paris is the only real fashion hub in the world. It's a truly international fashion capital. You can find designers from all corners of the world: Belgium, Japan, India, Spain, everything. Everything is in there. The Chambre Syndicale does a wonderful job in creating a schedule that's really exciting all the days. And you can see that they take a lot of care in having one big week. You can always make discoveries in Paris. There is always something that you were not prepared to see, but that pops up apparently out of nowhere. I like the city too, and the locations are always so beautiful. You can have some very lovely surprises. Like I didn't like at all the Jacques Mousse show in the Orangerie at Versailles, but the place, I've been there already for other shows, but it's so fantastic. And sometimes you're just surprised by the view, or even an industrial building. Sometimes it's just a magical place. Like last year when Dries did his last show in June for menswear, it was an industrial building, but it was made in such a beautiful way. The catwalk was all gold leaf. As we left the show, there was a giant disco ball rolling inside a room, but the disco ball was really like giant, almost like the whole room. Paris is a city that's been made throughout history to be loved, to be looked at.
Would you ever live there?
I could also overcome the rudeness of the Parisians sometimes, but yes, I could live there. Yes. And the city is a little bit complex to navigate because there is roadworks all the time. What I also like about Paris is that if you have enough time, you can walk from place to place. And walking through Paris, the most beautiful thing. Actually, if I can, because I write most of my stories on the phone, and somehow I managed to learn how to walk, drive, and not get hit by any car or any other pedestrians. So I love to walk, and sometimes you just turn and see a beautiful building or see a beautiful angle. It's really a magical place.
And you're talking about writing your commissioned reviews while you're walking through Paris on your phone.
Yes, yeah.
That's insane.
Or in the car if I am in a rush.
You've actually also expressed one of your worst fears as being the idea that you could become static in your thinking or writing. But how is it that you combat that outcome in your day-to-day? What is it that you do to avoid that from happening?
Doubt, as I said before. And I try to learn as much as possible from younger. I befriend younger people, like really younger than me, because I'm interested in the point of view and in the references because they are different from mine. That is very important to me because seeing things through other people's eyes can help you fine-tune your vision and look at things that you've never looked at before. My fear of becoming static is starting to look back and thinking that the past was better than the present. And of course, the past was better than the present for every generation. So I think that maybe my parents thought that my generation in the early 80s was like completely lost. Now we are demonizing, I don't know, TikTok or Instagram. Back then it was video games. So there is always something that the older generation don't understand about the newer. And I don't want to get that kind of moralistic stance on things. And also in fashion, what I really like is something always that surprises me, that makes me think, or where I see brain and invention at work. But sometimes some moments in history are not about that. This moment in history is not about invention. It's not about the thing. It's about how you put things together. It's more about the editing or the mixing or the curating. Jonathan Anderson is so good that he's a curator design. Of course, he has designed people with him, but he will be remembered not as much for the shapes that he has created, but how he has assembled so many different things together into one thing that makes sense. And it makes sense because there is a curator mind, his own mind, at work in this. And there is a notion that is very important, that is often neglected, a taste behind. That makes sense. And that makes him non-easily replicable, because that kind of clarity in taste comes from having learned what to like along your whole life. It's not about putting things together at random. I'm always drawn to everything that's elongated, that's vertical. For me, it's like the epitome of beauty. So I remember this being in my mind since I was very little. Everything that was long, even in, cartoons on the telly, if the characters were long, I was like glued to the screen. And then I studied art history, and then you start seeing more things that where elongation is important. And then your taste gets a little bit more in depth, and it becomes more structured, more nuanced. So you can see verticality in different things, in a building, in a sculpture, in a dress, in a painting. That is what I mean, that the roots of taste are almost instinctual, but then there is a thing that comes from the brain. It's a very interesting and complex topic because it's part rational and part completely irrational.
That sounds very philosophical.
Completely.
leaning into what you were just saying about preferring to always look forward, to not fall prey to the idea of being static or becoming static. What are your thoughts on this present moment where the sort of titans of the old guard in terms of magazine editors are slowly starting to officially all retire? And then you have historical institutions such as two of your favorites like ID and The Face who are being relaunched by new teams. How do you feel about those types of massive shifts when it comes to looking forward?
I'm, let's say, a pessimist optimist. So I always look at things with a critical eye, but my first feeling is that the future is going to be bright. I want to believe that. I don't want to close the door on whatever happens before it happens, because that would be a very static and very moralistic way. We cannot have Terry and Trisha back because they were also an expression of their moment, that moment in time. So there is people that are expressing this moment. So I will look at what they do. And for me, the most important thing is not to make comparisons to the past, because otherwise, of course, the new idea or the new face will never be the idea or the face that I loved. When I wrote the review of the first Julian Nauser show in March for the Business of Fashion, I got a very nice note from the CEO of the brand, who is a friend of mine, because I wrote, making comparisons between this guy and Dries is pointless. He has got his point of view and is moving forward. And my friend just told me, you've done more with this, with your positive review of the show, because for us, that's what's important. So it's like looking forward. What has done has been done. Julian has been working in Dries for a long time, so he knows where, I hate the word codes, but let's say what is the stylistic framework to do with a Dries. But he also has his own personality, so he can only look forward. My reaction to Glenn Martin's first show at Maison Margiela was a little bit mild, because Margiela was one of my early fashion passions. But I cannot make any comparison between what he does and what Martin has done. It was another moment. So I can only judge what it is doing now and acknowledge the fact that the house now is another thing. I hate when people say, oh, is it Balenciaga? You should have done this. I remember that when 10 years ago, Demna was appointed as the creative director of Balenciaga, a colleague of mine made a laugh. That, okay, it's going to destroy the brand. And I was already very interested in Vêtements. And I told him, let's look, because the guy has a very strong eye for certain things. So maybe he can give us things that we don't expect at all. And honestly, for me, the very first show from Demna at Balenciaga was the show of the decade. It's fantastic in fashion when you see a show and you think this is the shift. When you see that the tide is changing, it happens less and less, but when it happens, everybody feels that. When there is something that turns the cards on the table for everyone, you can see that immediately. And that's a wonderful feeling, because it energizes the designer, but it also energizes the person or the critic who's looking at that.
Well, speaking of storytelling and different mediums, you've said that your dream publication would be mercilessly pictureless. Tell us more, because I kind of wonder if people are even capable of consuming information in the absence of visual aids these days.
That statement, that was a little bit of a provocation, stems from when I work mostly for the newspaper in Italy. I don't put pictures of every show, of course. And also the size of the pictures depends on the importance of the brand and how they deal with the newspaper. So maybe you have a big picture of a show that you completely hate and you have to talk at length about because it's a big advertiser, and maybe the show that you really like ends up with no picture or a small picture. So I thought, oh, it would be fantastic to have a fashion magazine with no pictures, just words. And also because I think, Christopher, that words have a fantastic power that can unleash the imagination. In my experience, I make little workshops in schools and stuff. So in fashion, we use mood boards a lot. But what strikes me sometimes is that the mood board becomes not the springboard for a collection, but it becomes the limitation of a collection, because what's in the mood board ends up in the collection. Once I saw in a mood board pictures from one of my favorite Helmut Lang shows, which was in the 90s, and models were wearing red stockings. So I thought, okay, there is this picture. Maybe it's about having something strange together, like stockings with a slit threads. There cannot be a pair of red stockings. I turned and there was a pair of red stockings with a pink dress. This is when the mood board becomes a limitation. Words can bring the imagination in which, of course, they make things more difficult, but they can bring the imagination in whichever place one wants to. So if I would ever be the teacher, yet let's say at a final year project at school, I would give my brief just with words, with no mood boards. A magazine with no pictures would be very interesting. So people should just imagine. And also, I think that today it would be very easy. You can log on Bob Runway or whatever you like, or you just go to Instagram and see the pictures about the whole show. So you don't need to add the pictures with my text. You can look for pictures elsewhere and maybe have a fantasy around my writing.
What you're describing is also the difference in the user experience of someone reading a book versus watching a film based on said book.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's always like that. And it also comes from my experience when I hear a designer describing me his collection and me seeing the collection on the rack. That's the moment when the fantasy becomes reality, but it's not like landing on the ground, but crashing on the ground.
Do you think that you would ever be interested in finding yourself on Substack?
I have to say that I've been getting familiar with the platform just recently. As I told you at the beginning of our conversation, I need commission.
You don't blog?
I don't blog. I would maybe make just a collection of writings that I've written here and there. I know this can sound a little bit strange, but I need to work with an editor. I don't feel easy in self-publishing. I want to have an exchange with someone. In this sense, my favorite editor is Jonathan Wingfield. He's the best because we have very long conversation about my writings before I actually write. I do the same with Emanuele Farnetti at Di La Repubblica and with Vikram at Business of Fashion. I need to talk with people and someone that goes through the text and tells me, maybe we can take this away or blah, blah. It's just the way I work with my mind. I want to have an exchange. I don't want to feel like a monologue, like I'm wonking with words for the reader. I want this to be meaningful. And sometimes as a writer, you get trapped in your own writing. You like a sentence too much to take it away. And someone who has no attachment to your text in that sense can just cut it away, you know?
No, it's so true. I mean, they always say everybody's better with an editor. We're talking about experience and pleasure and things we enjoy or prefer, in this case, parameters and constraints or rules and whatnot. But how would you define luxury today? Because obviously some people have newly described it as experiences or time or freedom or health or whatever it might be. But to you, how would you define luxury today?
Oh, that's a very hard question for me. First, I hate the word luxury because it's been so overused and used in the wrongest place. For me, the real luxury today is looking at things through your eyes and forming your opinion for yourself, not being directed by algorithms, other people's opinion, propaganda, storytelling. So having the freedom to explore something almost like you see that thing for the first time and you just be surprised. I hate the idea of entering into a room expecting already what I will see in the room. I like the idea of going in a place and soak my eyes with everything around me. I'm a big observer. I rarely go to parties. And if I go to observe people because people watching is really a guilty pleasure for me. I really like that. I am really fascinated by the way humans can interact or how a social structure or a hierarchy can be apparent just in a matter of very few things. I find so fascinating how you can place yourself in the social ladder by the way you dress or not dress, how many meanings you can convey to people just not speaking, through mannerism, through dressing, to body posture, to silent language.
Now I'm curious, do you think of yourself as an introvert or an extrovert?
I'm an introvert, big time, but as all introverts, I can be very bold. Introverts can blow their boldest move, the most unexpected and probably untimely moment. I'm very introvert. I think because of that, I'm quite bold in the way I dress, even though the dressing is quite rigorous or monastic. But I know that it's my shield, and I know that if I dress in a certain way, that's the way that attracts attention rather than diverting them. I'm an introvert also because it takes a lot of time for me to talk to people. I prefer to be silent. For me, the worst thing is being at a dinner with people I don't like that much at my side. I'm very bad at small talk.
Mm-hmm.
probably the worst at small talk. Once I was at a dinner, I think in Roma, and across from me was the artist Caterina Jeb, the photographer who does pictures with a big scanner. And she was an artist that I wanted to meet for a long time. And she was exactly the kind of woman that I imagined there to be. So we went talking the whole time. And the day after, she invited me to her studio. But I've been to dinner where I was like completely silent. And I'm dead sure that people with me thought I was completely dumb because I was not saying one word.
Yeah, but sometimes silence is a power move. I remember watching a funny sort of meme on your stories during Couture. And I don't remember what the visual was exactly, but it was essentially illustrating someone who pretends to be having fun wherever they go. And your kind of added caption was me every time I attend a fashion show. Tell me more, because that was hysterical given your role in the industry.
So it was a video of a cat with a very grumpy expression looking through a window. Because you have to know that every time that there is I don't know for which kind of astral motivation, but I always end up in the video of the show. If there is a live streaming, people see me. And I get so many messages from friends with a screenshot of my face looking super grumpy. And they say, okay, you're enjoying the show. So that the expression of that cat, it was like really super grumpy, not liking what was on the catwalk, is exactly my face as I see it in those pictures. Because I have this thing in mind that my face is completely neutral, so nobody can see what I think from my face, while actually everybody can see. That's the response that I get the most from my friends, that my face speaks even if I don't speak. So if I don't like someone, it's always super apparent, like right away. So I made fun of that because the cat was exactly me in that moment, looking super grumpy and thinking of myself, okay, nobody's seeing how much I don't like this show.
I mean, it was hysterical. I remember looking at it and thinking it was so funny coming from you of all people. And we have to ask you our namesake question, of course, which is, what is contemporary now?
What is contemporary now? I've been thinking about this since you asked me to be in this. What's contemporary? It's so difficult to grasp because contemporary is what in the moment, but the moment is extremely transient. So probably what's contemporary now is avoiding definition in a moment that's all about being defined by things or by what you do, what you see. Because in the end, what is the algorithm is a way to define you and your taste and your proclivities through what you like. And for me, avoiding definition is in a way of being fluid and not easy to grasp. And probably this fluidity is what is contemporary now, if it makes sense.
No, it makes perfect sense. It sounds very much like a goal we should all pursue, like Bruce Lee telling us to behave like water.
Absolutely. That's it. My element is water. Absolutely.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Angelo. I'm so glad we got to do this, and it was an absolute pleasure. I appreciate your time.
Absolutely. For me as well.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of What's Contemporary Now. A special thanks to our producer, Sasha Grindblatt. Audio post-production by Chase Coughlin with original theme music by Joseph Topmiller and Chase Coughlin of The Black Soft. And visual design by Aaron Meager and Graham Prentice. Subscribe now to be the first to catch new episodes each week, and if you've enjoyed listening, we'd love to hear from you. Leave us a review and let us know your thoughts. Your feedback helps us improve and reach more listeners like you. Follow us on Instagram and LinkedIn for additional content and join the conversation. Let us know what you think is contemporary now.